Hello everyone, and welcome to a deck profile for Fenrir Control for the premium format. Fenrir is a really weird deck. Your primary win con with Fenrir is not dealing 6 damage like most decks. Your primary win con is stalling the game out until you're in a position where you can run the opponent out of cards in deck. You're doing this using a card called Melissa that forces the opponent to call over all the units they have in play, which, if they have a large number of units in play, will empty their deck quickly. In the meantime, in order to get their deck small enough to the point that will kill them, you are playing lots of defensive cards that stall the game and drag the game out, and you're playing ways to stack triggers onto the top of your deck so you can heal more often, so that you can just delay the inevitable, and hopefully at the last second, run your opponent out of the last few cards. This deck also has a way to recycle its drop zone into the deck, powerful individual card recursion options, and great access to countercharge and board control. So it has all the tools in order to make sure that happens, but it is a very difficult deck to play, and any mistakes will likely cause instant defeat. This deck has, however, proven that it can hang with even the best decks in the format. It won Worlds in the hands of Parody, I think was his handle, something like that. That guy won Worlds with this deck in 2024, as of the same year as this recording. And you have to be really solid. You have to know your deck perfectly and how every deck in the format works so that you can successfully disrupt it. But if you can learn those things, it's been proven that you can take this deck even to a very competitive event and crush it. Without any further ado, let's get into the actual list. We're starting off with 4 copies of Mythic Beast Fenrir, and 1 Genesis starter hanging out here in the background. Mythic Beast Fenrir has this is the V version of the card. It has a really powerful effect. You can Soul Blast 1 or more cards and search your deck for a card with the same grade as the sum of the grades you Soul Blasted, the exact same number. And then you reveal that card and add it to hand, shuffle the deck, and then call a card from hand to R. So this can find any tool that you're missing access to. It can find exactly what solves the problem that you're facing at the current moment. And it lets you also get cards from Soul into Drop at will, which can then let you set up with your countercharger to put them back on the bottom of the deck, so you can put triggers from Soul back to the bottom. And you can also put cards that you want to recur with Deal Ruin back into your hand by putting them into Soul and then back to hand. On top of that, it has the effect that when a card is put from Soul into Drop, you can counterblast and call that card to R, which is a really strong effect. This is not limited to just during your turn, so during the opponent's turn, your goal is to Soul Blast out cards with powerful defensive effects, and then call those cards to get those effects in the middle of the opponent's battle phase and disrupt their game plan. It is a once per turn, so you're only getting 1 big defensive play per battle phase, but you got to make it count. And if you do, it can really just shut down the opponent's turn on the spot. On top of that, it also gives you multi-attack, because if you Soul Blast in your battle phase, you can call that card and get another attacker. And then this card also can Soul Blast 1 when it attacks and give itself 10k. So it can apply pressure when need be, and it can make itself a good powered attacker in order to attack the opponent's rear guards. And it can Soul Blast out Vanir Gondor in order to set up multiple uses of Vanir Gondor in the same turn. Overall, it's a really solid grade 3, and you must ride this or the deck doesn't function. Everything about this deck is designed with the understanding that you will be on this Vanguard at all times. Next up is 2 copies of Mythical Destroyer Beast Vanir Gondor. This is the powerful defensive tool that we're trying to set up with these calls during the battle phase. This has the effect that when it's placed on V or R, you Soul Blast 1, choose an opponent's rear guard and retire it, and then if this unit was on V, you choose all of their rear guards instead of just 1. So if you can Soul Blast this out of the battle phase and call it for Counterblast, you can then Soul Blast 1 and kill something, which means that if you can guard 1 attack with the effect that is causing you to Soul Blast, and then this card can Soul Blast 1 and retire the other one, you can end their battle phase essentially. And then on top of that, at the end of the battle, it attacked a Vanguard. You can put this unit into Soul and look at the top 3 cards of the deck, put 1 on top, 1 into Soul, and 1 on the bottom. So you can stack the deck to make sure that you hit more triggers. You can get important pieces into Soul that way. And because this card can be called by a Fenrir skill when it's Soul Blasted, you can use this effect multiple times in one battle phase. You can attack, stack the deck, swing with your Vanguard, Soul Blast, call this out, and then get the triggers that you stacked, and then swing with this again, and then stack the deck 1 more time so that on your opponent's turn you have defensive triggers on top. This is really, really strong. usage of this deck stacking and this card and the card that lets you Soul Blast and call this out in the battle phase will be the key main way you defend yourself against the opponent, hitting triggers at will, hitting heals more often, and killing their units in their battle phase. Next up is one copy of Reverence Rush Dragon. This is the effect that when it's placed on R from hand, you Soul Blast 1, choose a grade 2 or greater card from the drop, and put it on top of the deck. So you're going to put the grade 3 heal triggers on top so that you can hit the heal triggers at will, which makes this really, really powerful. And we're only playing one because we can hard search it with our Vanguard whenever we want. And even if a card ends up in damage, we can eventually get it back in as long as we can heal it at some point. Next up is our grade 2s, and we're starting with 4 copies of Destiny Sorcerer Ramonis. This is the V Ride Fixer for Genesis. At the beginning of your ride phase, if your Vanguard's grade 1 or less, you discard this, look at the top 5, choose a grade 2 or less card, and add it to hand, and then shuffle the deck. This will help you set up your ride line to make sure you don't miss on anything. This will help you find the important defensive pieces, because this can find Veratrum, the main grade 2 we're using to trigger our Vanguard skill in the battle phase, and this can find anything else you need. It has an on-attack skill when it's boosted, but we're probably not going to use this. But in the chance you do, it's Counterblast 1, choose a crit or draw from the soul, and activate the trigger effect and put it on the bottom of the deck. That's more useful in aggressive versions of Fenrir, where you're using Ultima and this to set up a crit that goes onto the entire board, but we're not doing that in this deck. Next up is Reverent White Sorcerer Veratrum. This is our main defensive piece, but along with Vandergonder. When this unit is put on G, you Counterblast 1 and Soul Blast 3. Choose one of your opponent's Rs with a standing unit. Your opponent looks at the top card of their deck and calls to the chosen R. And then your opponent's card's auto abilities do not activate from this call. Notably, this does not choose the unit. This chooses the circle, so it gets around things like that. And Forced Call gets around a lot of effects that say this unit can't be bound or can't be retired or can't be put in another zone, because you can still force your opponent to call over that card, even under those effects, I believe. Double check with the judge, but I'm pretty sure that this gets around cannot be put on other than R by effects. And then on top of that, it has, because the cost is Counterblast 1, Soul Blast 3, it lets you trigger your Fenrir in the battle phase, and that will let you call your Vandergonder, which will let you set up the 2-for-1 that will retire another rear guard and force them to call over another thing to make the attacker suck, to set up a really good defensive play that will buy you a lot of time. Every time, if you can do this once a turn, you can essentially cut your opponent's attacking power in half. Against decks that rely on like restanding rear guards like Shiranui, this can be very devastating because you've just gotten rid of 2 restanders and that's hard for them to get back. And against decks where they've stacked a bunch of triggers onto a rear guard, you can then force them to call over the unit with the triggers and then retire the other thing, and you can buy yourself a lot of lifespan with that. This is a really good card. It's a really expensive effect, so a lot of this deck is dedicated to setting up the resources needed to pay for this combo every turn. Next up is 2 copies of Unappeasable Biter Gleipnir. When this unit is placed on V or R, you Counterblast 1 and Soul Charge 1, and choose a card from the soul and put it into hand. So this will help you get any important pieces that have been soul charged into your hand. And then when it attacks, you Soul Blast 1, and this unit gets 10k until end of turn, which can trigger your Fenrir. So you can call something out from your soul that you need into play. Just a good setup card. Getting pieces from soul into hand is really important for this, but we don't want to play this that much. We just want to like ride this once or call it once, so we're playing 2 copies. And then we have 2 copies of Knight of Excision, Dear Ruin, which is another way to get important pieces out of soul and back in a hand, and from drop in a hand as well. When this is placed on R, if your Vanguard is only 1 clan, which it always will because we're Genesis, you Soul Blast 1 and discard a card. Choose a card with only the same clan as your Vanguard from the drop and put it in hand. So this can get anything except the overdress cards and generics, which is really powerful. And we can use this to make sure we can hit the maximum number of Melissas to try to deck our opponent out if we have a ton of soul. And we can just get any important piece that we need. Then we have 1 copy of Gold Gown. This is a weird card, and it's in for one very specific reason. When this unit is placed on R, you can Soul Blast 1 and call a grade 1 from your hand to R, and the unit called for this cost gets 5k until end of turn. So the reason to do this is because if we can get it into Soul and then Soul Blast it out with something like Veratrum, then we can call this card, and because this calls a grade 1 from hand, it can trigger our Witch of Frogs Melissa, which is our mill card. It can activate that card in our opponent's battle phase. which is a really strong effect because Witcher Frog's Melissa has a devastating effect to the board. So playing this is really important to set that play up specifically. It also lets our opponent ambush them. Lets us ambush our opponent with the Melissa when they're not expecting it. So they can get hard punished thinking that they have an opportunity to kill us on a specific turn and they call a full board. We can then go into Gold Gown, set up the Melissa, and force them to call over their entire board and deck them out. Now, without any further ado, let's get to the actual Witcher Frog's Melissa, the mill card, the card that makes this deck possible. Witcher Frog's Melissa, when placed from hand, you Soul Blast 3, so it's a heavy cost. Your opponent looks at the same number of cards on the top of their deck as the number of rear guards and calls them to R with units, and shuffles the deck. Your opponent's abilities do not activate from this call. So, when your opponent has a full board of, let's say, 5 units, this is getting 5 cards out of their deck from the top of their deck. It also will call over everything, so any important units they have in play will be eliminated and replaced with bad cards from the top of the deck, probably a mixture of triggers and like grade 1s and stuff that they don't want to attack with. Normally, you set up the combo kill by, on a turn in the late game when your opponent has a full board, you go into Melissa and then you play a Deer Ruing to get the Melissa back and you play the Melissa again, or you just play 2 Melissas because you've been searching them up and holding them in your hand. And you set up the win that way. But if your opponent is playing a deck where they can get rid of all their units every turn, like Grand Blue or Shiranui, where they can bounce their whole board every turn, you can go instead for the Gold Gown and Witcher Frog's Melissa combo during their battle phase to punish them for trying that and still find a way to deck them out. So it's important to have access to that package. But this is a really solid card. This is really scary, and a lot of people are going to misplay and like not call board against you because they're trying to avoid deck out from this card. So they're going to be conservative and only call small board, but that's going to make it easier for you to control the game and survive. So you can play really patient, and you can just hold on to this card forever because in the long game you will win. This is a deck that can recycle itself really easily. So eventually your opponent will deck out and you won't. So time is on your side in the sense that the longer the game goes on, the more pressure is on the opponent to find a way to kill you, which then will lead them to eventually misplay, generally speaking, and you'll get a window to use this card. You just got to pick your moment correctly. You're also going to want to generally play this card later rather than earlier because it's a burst source of mill. It's going to take a lot of cards out of their deck at once, and so the best time to use it is when the amount of cards you're taking out is enough to win you the game. It's better to stall the game and wait, and then play this right at the end to finish them off. And we're playing 2 copies of this card. Because 1, we don't want to damage it. We want to see it every game. And because playing multiples of this in the same turn is a good way to kill the opponent out of nowhere. And then the rest of our grade 1s, we're playing 4 copies of Apple Witch Cider. This is a really good way to build soul. What this does is at the end of the battle it boosted, you can soul charge 1 and return it to hand, or you can soul charge 2. So which either if you need a lot of soul, you can keep this in play and soul charge 2, or if you don't need a lot of soul and you just want another high shield value card, you can bounce this. And then when this is put on G, you put a card from hand into soul, and then this unit gets 5k shield for every 3 cards in your soul. And this deck builds a lot of soul, and our G Guardians also build a lot of soul, so sometimes this can guard for well over 40k. Next up is our countercharger, Claimer Harry. This says GB1 once per turn. When your card is put into drop from your soul, put that card on the bottom of the deck and countercharge 1. That's really powerful because we have a lot of incidental Soul Blast, and getting multiples of these in play will give us a lot of countercharge. And this is once per turn, so we can countercharge once on our turn and then once on the opponent's turn, so we can build a lot of resources. And this is primarily how we're able to afford the expensive ability of Veratrum. And the combo Veratrum plus Fenrir, which costs 2 CB. We can afford to pay that because we have such a good countercharger. So you're going to want to get at least one of these in a play. Getting 2 in a play isn't bad. And you're going to make sure you activate this as much as possible. Importantly, it also doesn't say normal unit, so it's when a card is put into drop zone from soul. So if you soul blast any triggers, you can put those triggers to the bottom of the deck. And then if you use Fenrir to search your deck, you can shuffle the deck and get those triggers back into circulation. So this can recycle the over trigger or heals that you need. And then we have 2 copies of Magic of Colored Flame Rare Limp. This is a card that Minerva plays on Standard, if you're familiar with that deck. What this does is when it's placed on R, other than during the battle phase, if you have a Vanguard with only Genesis in its clan, which we will, Counterblast 1 and Soul Blast 1, draw a card, choose a card from the hand, reveal it, call it to R, and if it's a unit with grade less than or equal to Vanguard, and then discard it if not. So this is a just a way to draw cards if we need to, but we're probably not going to use the first skill. What we're here for is the second skill, which is at the end of the battle it boosted. If you have a Vanguard with only Genesis, put 2 rear guards in the same column as this unit into Soul, so itself and the thing it boosted. Choose a card from your drop with only Genesis and put it in a hand. So this is just another recursion piece. It can get basically anything important in the deck for no cost, essentially just itself and the unit we attacked with. If you use this with some of the units that you don't really want to keep in play anyways, like Gleipnir or Diaruing, you can basically get free value. And then we have 1 copy of Mythic Beast Skull. This is a search card for Fenrir specifically. When you place it on R from hand, you reveal a grade 3, search for a grade 3 with Fenrir in its name, put it in hand, and then shuffle and discard. And then you can pitch this for Stride as a grade 3. This is really just to make sure that we get Fenrir every single game. That's all it's here for. And then we have 1 copy of Light Elemental Honolly. This is the anti-multi-attack card. Any rear guard attack after the 5th or more battle has to pay Counterblast or they can't attack. And this has been eroded, so you can remove this from the game on your turn, and then the effect is only active on the opponent's next turn, so it's a one-sided effect. But against decks that can't get rid of units easily, it's worth keeping this in play. So you'll need to know the matchup knowledge required to make that call. And if you can make that call correctly, it's really good. And then we have 1 copy of Elementary Sanctitude, the best PG in the game, and it gets around Guard Restrict, which is one of the ways that we could conceivably lose. And then Evergreen Transfer, this is an optional Blitz order. You can play a lot of different things in this spot because control decks are really flexible with what cards they can play, and you can fine-tune this to your meta. But I play this because it's another way to Soul Blast in the battle phase, so it's another way to call Vanagonder. What this does is for Soul Blast 1, you choose a unit and it gets plus 25k power until end of battle, and then if your Vanguard gets the red text, all your opponent's 100 million units get -1 crit. So you can randomly survive the overtrigger with this. But it's primarily here to be able to Soul Blast out Vanagonder. And then we have our triggers. We're playing 4 of the grade 3 heal, because this can pitch for Stride, this can give us a useful defensive effect, and we can stack it to the top of the deck with Reverence Rush Dragon. We have 3 draw trigger PGs, because we are playing 1 Elementaria, so we don't play 4. And we don't want to play as many crits as we normally would in a deck like this, because we just want to stall the game. We actively want to damage deny the opponent and keep them off their resources. And then we are playing 3 copies of Perobi. This is the standard draw trigger for Keter Sanctuary. It's a 10k shield draw trigger. That's all it does. And then we have 3 copies of the Stride crit, just to make sure we can pay for Stride on the turns that we want to Stride, which isn't every turn for this deck. And then we have 2 copies of Dreaming Dragon. This is another card that makes the mill win condition possible. What this does is at GB1, you put this unit at the top of your deck at the end of your turn from R, and if you do, you return all the cards in your drop to your deck and shuffle, and then if you return 10 or more cards, you draw a card. So this is really good, because if you have 10 cards to drop, it's free recycling, essentially. It replaced itself with the card draw, and it can get everything in your drop zone back. So if you can position yourself such that most of your drops in as triggers, you can really increase your trigger density. This lets you grind for infinity. Your opponent will eventually run out of cards, and every time they use a card, that card's gone forever, usually speaking. But for us, we will eventually get that card back. So if the game keeps going, we never run out of tools, but the opponent will run out of tools. And we won't run out of cards, but they will run out of cards. And so the pressure is really on them to kill us, and we can just sit back and relax. And then lastly, the Overtrigger. 1 copy of Spiritual King of Night Sky. Oh, this is a doozy. Nixius Zelia. This is the Darkness OT, or the Black OT, or the Purple OT, you might hear it called. This OT, when you drive check it, you pick a card from your damage zone, put it in a hand, and then call a card from hand and give it 10k. So this is in here primarily as a way to fix our damage zone. If something in the damage zone that we want in our hand is there, we can get it back with this. You can also play the blue Overtrigger. The blue Overtrigger will pick up a card from drop instead and give you a crit. But we don't really want the crit. We almost never want to actually kill the opponent with damage. It will happen occasionally, and we will sometimes pivot into being a beatdown deck, but not often enough for us to really want the blue Overtrigger over it in every game. And this being able to grab things from damage is more important. It stops us from losing because of important pieces in the damage zone, which is something that Angel Feather can do that we can't. But you could easily make an argument for the blue Overtrigger. And regardless of which one you pick, remember you can recycle the Overtrigger back into your deck with Claimer Harry if it's in your soul ever, which means that if you guard it, it's easy to get it from drop into soul with other cards, and then from soul back into deck. And then next is the G-Zone. We're starting off with 2 copies of Amaruta Ampharos. You can play 3, and probably should, to be honest, but I'm playing a tech card instead. Amaruta is a really good resource builder. What it does is, as an axe skill on V, you can counterblast 1 and turn a card from the G-Zone face up, and then pick a rear guard and give it 10k to crit, and then if your soul's 4 or less cards, you draw 2 cards and soul charge 5. So this is the easiest way to build the soul necessary for Veratrum, because Veratrum is going to cost 4 soul to do the Veratrum plus Vandergander play. And then it has a really niche effect that at the end of the battle attack, you soul blast 15, stand a rear guard, and until end of turn, your opponent cannot call sentinels. Maybe once in a 1,000 games you'll use that to kill an opponent, but it's almost never going to come up. This is our primary stride, and it's pretty decent just because it soul charges 5 and for no other reason. Next, we're playing 2 copies of Mythical Destroyer Beast Vandergander. This is a deck stacking stride. For the cost of a GB2, for the cost of Soul Blast 6, you turn a copy of it face up, and then you, when it attacks, you look at the top 4, and you put any number of them on the top of the deck and put the rest on the bottom. So you're going to use this when you need to hit multiple heals to stay in the game. You're going to spend a lot of your soul to do it, but you're going to stack 4. You're going to look at the top 4 and stack the best cards out. So you're potentially going to hit the over trigger or heals. If you've somehow pushed the opponent up high, you can sometimes swing with this, and your opponent might be forced to no-guard this because they need the counterblast, and you could stack a bunch of crits. But that's pretty unlikely. Mostly you're using this to try to hit heals. Then 1 copy of Hero Deity of Polar Extremity Marduk. This is a Superior Stride card when you're going first. When you attack, if your Vanguard is grade 3, you counterblast 1 and soul blast 6 and stride onto V as rested, and then this becomes the attacking unit, and it gets the power and crit from triggers that your Vanguard had. So this is just to build GB during the first grade 3 turn and to draw more cards if you have a bunch of soul, but you don't have a good hand. And it's early in the game. It's pretty rare that we use this as a regular stride. It basically is never going to happen. And then we have 1 copy of Soul Offering Heavenly Dragon Yagda Naruga. This is another potential mill card, actually. What it does is when it attacks, you turn a card from the G-Zone face up, you choose any number of cards with different grades from your drop and put them into Soul, and this unit gets 10k until end of turn. And then when it attacks, when your opponent's unit is put on G, other than from their deck, you Soul Blast 3 and retire that Guardian, and then your opponent looks at the top card of the deck and calls it to G. And this is not a once per turn, so as long as you have enough soul, you can keep forcing your opponent to call to G from the top of the deck whenever they guard with something, which means you can sometimes force through damage with this, which is very funny, but mostly it puts the opponent in an awkward spot, because if you attack with this and they guard, they're going to get milled, but if they don't guard, you're going to hit. So if they're at like medium amounts of damage and you've shown them crits, and they know you're playing crits, then this can put them in a weird spot, but mostly this is to get 4, because you're going to get a 0, 1, 2, a 3, and a 0, 1, 2, and a 3 from your drop and a soul when it attacks, so it's going to build some soul, and it's going to give you an option to mill the opponent a little bit. This can sometimes checkmate them if they're really low on cards. Like if you played your Melissas and you soul blasted 3 and made them call over the board, and now their deck is like 4 cards or something, you can swing with this, and then they can't guard anything. And if they get hit, they take damage, they mill themselves 1 card, because 1 card goes in the damage zone, but if they guard, you get to mill them another card. And if they have to still guard with more, you can keep doing that. Next up is a single copy of Moosebell. This is what I'm playing instead of a 3rd Amaruta. What this does is you flip a card in the G-Zone face up, and then you Soul Blast any number of cards. Choose a rear guard for each card Soul Blasted, and they get 4k. And then if you Soul Blasted 3 or more, you draw a card and countercharge. So this is just a way to turn Soul into CB. Next, we have 1 copy of Mythical Hellsky Beast Fenrir. I do not know why this is in the G-Zone for this deck. I see it in other lists, and I assume it's in here just because it's a card with Fenrir. And the other lists are all playing 1 copy, and really it doesn't matter what that last card in the G-Zone is. So I assume that the creator of this deck put it in because he likes the card, and everyone else has just been copying it. But what it does is at GB2, your rearguard's revelation ability changes to when this unit's placed on R, look at the top 2, search for up to 1 card from among them, put it into soul, put the rest on the top of the deck in any order. Revelation is a Genesis keyword where you get to stack the deck and either soul charge it or put it on or leave it on top, and if you soul charge, you rest, I think. And then it has Counterblast 1, Soul Blast 3, draw a card, and if you do not, put up to one card from the top of your deck into Soul, and then choose one of your rear guards on that unit. This unit get 3k. So it's Counterblast, Soul Blast to draw one card, which is, I guess, something. But Amaruta is Counterblast and draw 2 cards. So if you need to draw cards, you're usually going to go into that. But you can't go into Amaruta, I guess, if you have more than 4 cards in Soul. So I guess the niche case for this is you have too many cards in Soul and you just want to draw cards with your Stride. There you go. But I have literally never used this card. And then 1 copy of the Progenitor Dragon. It's worth going into this actually if you can early, because it'll set you up for later. What this does is it has the skill in the G zone. It cannot be turned face up by abilities, and if it is face up, you can Stride without paying the Stride cost. And then on V, when it's placed, Counterblast 1, Soul Blast 1, and you call as many cards from your hand to R as possible, and you draw 3. So you play this when your hand is really bad, hopefully when you have like only 1 or 2 cards in hand, and you can draw a new hand with this. And then you can swing and get drive checks and potentially build a decent hand out of it. If you can go into this on your first Stride, going second or something, by discarding a card with the same name as your Vanguard, you can potentially set yourself up to have free Stride for the rest of the game and generate virtual card advantage that way. So it's worth looking for windows where you can go into this when you don't need to go into any of your other Strides. And again, you can go into this when you can't really use Amaruta's effect. And then we have our G Guardians, which I'll lay out all at once because G Guardians are packaged and must be considered together. We have these 6 G Guardians. Starting off with the 2 good ones, we have 2 copies of Sky Enforcing Light Dragon Anavarta. What this does is, when it's put on G, you put a card from hand or rear into Soul, and this unit gets 10k shield, and then you put a total of 2 cards from hand or rear guard into Soul, and choose one of your Vanguard, or choose one of your opponent's units, and it gets -2 crit. So, notably, it's crit until end of turn, and then it's pick a unit, so you can potentially guard 2 attacks with this 1 card. You can guard something with the 25k shield G Guardian and then pick the other attacker to give -2 crit, and that's another way to blow your opponent out and essentially end their turn. On top of that, it can put any useless cards that you've ever done copies of, or stuff you haven't played that you don't want, like copies of Gleipnir, copies of Dear Ruin that you've already used, copies of Melissa that you've already used, things like that. You can put them into Soul and get some extra value out of them with this. And then we have 2 copies of Ultimate Regalia of Affection Air. This is one of our best resource building Strides, or G Guardians, sorry. When it's placed on G, you choose up to 4 cards from the drop with different grades and put them into Soul, and if you put 2 or more, this gets 5k shield, and if you put 4 or more, it gets 10k shield. So it's a 30k shield G Guardian, which is usually enough to guard whatever you need to guard. And it will put 4 cards into Soul from drop, which you can set up pretty easily as long as you have a 0, 1, 2, and a 3. And remember, we're going to be Soul Blasting with a lot with Veratrum, so we can very easily engineer that board state. On top of that, because it's putting cards from drop into Soul and it's not really picky about what kind of unit they are, you can put things like the Over Trigger into Soul, and then Soul Blast it out, and then Claimer Harry can put it to the bottom of the deck and countercharge. So you can get triggers back into the deck. You can get a 3 and a 0 with this, so you can pick a grade 3 heal and a grade 0 trigger, and you can potentially get 2 triggers back into the deck in the same turn cycle by using your Claimer Harrys and Soul Blasting triggers for all your costs. You can like Soul Blast the grade 0 trigger, put it at the bottom of the deck on the opponent's turn, and then you can, on your turn, Soul Blast the 3 with Fenrir to find a grade 3, put it to the bottom of the deck with Claimer Harry, and set that up for later. So it's a really good way to make sure you can synergize with all your cards, and that's just one example of all the convoluted ways that Fenrir can set up crazy plays. And then we have Goddess of 7 Colors Iris. When this unit is placed on G, you choose up to 3 cards from your drop zone and put them into Soul, and if 3 cards are put, this unit gets 5k. So this doesn't care about what grades the units were, so if you have a bad drop zone where you don't have a variety of grades, you can go into this for a little bit less shield value, but still some decent defensive power, because if you get 3 units, this will still be 30k shield total. Or it'll be 20k shield, sorry. It's not 5k for each, it's 5k if you got 3. So it's still 20k shield, which is usually good enough. And then we have 1 copy of Witch Queen of Accomplishment, Laurier. This is the G Guardian Flipper. You choose face down G Guardian and turn it face up. And when this unit's placed on G, you pay the cost. If you do, choose 2 or more up to a total of 3 normal units with the same grade from your drop zone or Soul and put them back into deck. And then you get 5k until the battle for each card return and shuffle the deck. So this gets important things that you want in the deck to search for back into the deck. if you don't have access to any recursion in your hand, you can put important pieces like Melissa back into your deck, and then you can search for them with Fenrir skill. So that's one way to recycle cards. But it flips another G-Guardian face up, and G-Guardians are one of our primary ways to stay alive. So this is a heavy cost. It's not as free as it would seem. And we don't really have any payoff for hitting high GB, so we don't really want to flip over additional G-Guardians if we can help it. And then we have one copy of Harmonics Messiah, because every deck plays Harmonics Messiah. We're no exception. So that is the deck list. Let's go over what the defensive play looks like. You're going to be on a Fenrir Vanguard. You're going to have a bunch of cards in Soul, and one of them will be Veratrum. You're going to have a big Soul because you probably use something like Amaruta, which will Soul Charge 5. Your opponent's going to attack you. Let's say they have a board like this. Let's see, these are the opponent's 2 front row rear guards. They're going to swing with a rear guard that you don't want to get hit by. You're going to guard with Veratrum. You're going to Counterblast 1. You're going to Soul Blast 3. You're going to make sure one of those 3 cards is Fenrir Control. Then you're going to call this out with the Vanguard Seal by paying another Counterblast and paying another Soul Blast. Then Fenrir Control will retire something. And in this case, let's say it's the unit that's attacking you, because this is only 5k shield guard if you guard with Veratrum. So you're going to retire that unit, and then Veratrum will force them to call over the other unit, presumably with something bad. Let's say they hit a trigger. So now they have a bad attacker that doesn't hit your Vanguard. And you've essentially stopped 2 attacks with 1 card, albeit with 2 Counterblast and 4 Soul. So that's that play. You can also set up the same thing with Evergreen Transfer. And if you have a board of like Veratrum or Fenrir Control, let's say you have a board of Fenrir Control, a copy of Skull because you needed to find something, and then a copy of this that you boosted with and didn't bounce back to hand, you can G-Guardian into something like Enervata and put all 3 of these units into Soul to get a 25k shield G-Guardian and -2 crit to an opponent's unit, which is better the more that unit attacks. If they're a restand deck, this can be really devastating. So, give this camera 1 second to adjust the new lighting. Okay. So this is a really potent defensive play, and as you can see, that pretty quickly rebuilt that put 3 cards into Soul. So for 1 heal trigger, we got back enough Soul that if we had another Veratrum in hand, and it was another turn cycle, because Fenrir is a once per turn, we could do this again. We could set up a Fenrir Control again, and do another defensive play on the next turn, without accounting for any Soul Charge from our strides. Just the G-Guardians are enough to build the Soul back up to set up this play. And then when we're swinging with Fenrir Control, we're going to swing, move to Soul, we're going to look at the top 3 cards of the deck, we're going to try to stack triggers at the top, try to get a heal on top. We're also going to try to Soul Charge stuff that we don't really want in play, like Gold Gown or Deal Ruining or Gleipnir, anything that we don't want actively in our hand. And then we would drive check, Soul Blast 1, call the Fenrir out, or the Fenrir Control out with Counterblast, and then drive check. Oh, we hit a heal because we put 1 there, and then drive check again, something else. And then you can swing with Fenrir Control again to set up another top 3, and maybe we set up a draw trigger on top of the deck, put 1 thing into Soul and 1 thing to the bottom, and then when the opponent attacks us, we're going to hit a draw trigger on the first damage because we put it there on purpose. So that gives you a glimpse of how this deck can defend itself both with triggers and with powerful defensive play units that have useful Guardian effects. And after doing all this and stacking heals and then G-Guarding with that heal, then we can do things like Soul Blast out of 3. Let's say we Soul Charged a Fenrir, we can Soul Blast out of 3, and we can search for Reverence Rush Dragon. And then we can play Reverence Rush Dragon, stack that heal we G-Guardianed with to the top of the deck, and then we can drive check it with our Vanguard and have another G-Guardian for the next turn and heal a card out of our damage. Because, again, we're usually damage denying the opponent. We're trying to bully their rear guards more than anything. We're trying to avoid giving them the CB that they need to kill us. And so by doing that, we're always going to make sure our heals are alive and their heals aren't. We're going to make sure that we have the fewest amount of attacks and powerful effects we have to deal with because we're keeping their resources low, which means that cards like Conley that are not effective in some matchups suddenly become more effective because the opponent's resources are more strained than they otherwise would be. And there is a notable counterplay option that all decks have. Harmonics Messiah has a useful effect if you're at 0 or 1 damage. If you're when you place this on V or at the beginning of your turn, if this card is face up and your damage zone is 2 or less cards and no new card is put into your damage zone during your opponent's preceding turn, so if we damage deny them, put the card on the top of your deck into the damage zone and you draw a card. So Harmonics Messiah gives every deck a way out of hard damage denial. You can never truly give a deck 0 CB because this card exists. On top of that, every deck also has access to these grade 3 heals. And these grade 3 heals have another effect besides the defensive effect they're known for, which is that when it's placed on Arm of Hand, if you have no cards in the damage zone, you can put the top card of your deck into the damage zone. So every deck can ping themselves with this card and ping themselves with Harmonics Messiah, and thus have the bare minimum CB. So if they can function off of 1 CB for the entire game, you can never fully deny them resources. And so for those decks, you do have to consider giving them more damage. Although even decks that are really efficient and can survive with 1 CB can still get more power for more CB. And that's important to note because against decks like Mega Colony, they only need 1 CB to do Gridora. And once they have that 1 CB, they can countercharge it every turn. And so you can never truly keep Gridora from getting access to Gridora. And thus, this deck really suffers against Gridora. We can't G-Guardian against them, and we can't Call from Soul against them, so we are really limited in our ways to deal with them. Really, our options are limited to just stacking the deck with heals and Vandergonder and hoping that stalls the game long enough that we can outlast the number of Gridoras they have. Because all they have to do is go into this once, and they have enough CB for the rest of the game. So you do have some Nightmare matchups. You do have your opponent does have counterplay for your deck, even if you're playing optimally. But all the counterplay they have is generally going to be less efficient than the normal game plan. So if they are going for those plays, you're playing on easy mode essentially compared to what you normally would be facing if they had full counterblast and everything that they ever wanted. So that's the eternal struggle of playing Fenrir Control. Controlling your opponent's resources in a format where they keep adding tools for people to get resources when they're being hard damage denied. Fighting through decks that have ways to resist your of shutting down your game plan, like Mega Colony. Making sure that you can actually pay the cost for all this stuff when you're damage denying the opponent, because you're going to get fewer drive checks if you hard damage deny, because you can't attack unless they have something in play. So sometimes you're going to just be forced to give them damage just so you can drive check cards to make sure you have enough cards in hand for everything and to have the best chance of hitting heals and such. And for decks that don't care about CB, you're still going to be facing their full pressure. So there's a lot of things to consider, a lot of matchup knowledge that's required. Your mastery of defensive plays is going to have to be perfect, and if you mess it up, you will probably just die, because ultimately the things this deck is doing aren't very individually powerful. You're not hitting for gigantic numbers, you're not setting up an infinite combo or anything. You're just doing a bunch of annoying, detrimental, disruptive plays, and hoping that buys you enough time that this crazy mill card, Melissa, can just win the game out of nowhere. And sometimes that's enough, and sometimes you have to get creative. And if you look at 2024 Worlds footage, you can see this deck play out in top 8 a lot, and you can see there's a lot of places where the pilot had to make unconventional plays and had to even turn into an aggressive deck with this in order to win games, because his opponents counterplayed his defensive game plan so effectively. So you're going to have to get to that level of skill or something close to it to take this deck to the highest level. But at your locals, a lot of people are just going to fold to the straight defensive plan of calling a Vandergonder in the battle phase and shutting down 2 attacks. That's going to be good enough to beat like most casual players. But this deck gets better and better the more you practice it and grind it. I think there's probably only a handful of players in the world who can play this deck at the highest level. It's extremely difficult. So if you love mastering a challenging deck, this is definitely the deck for you. If you love defensive control decks, like blue control decks in Magic the Gathering, this is definitely the deck for you. I personally think it's something you need to keep your eye out for in the meta. There's always going to be that one guy who's learned this deck really good who's going to ruin your day in the Swiss rounds. So you need to be prepared for this. And maybe you can master this deck and you can beat that guy for someone else. You can ruin their day and just destroy them in the Swiss rounds because they don't know how to play against this. But that summarizes Fenrir Control. I think it is the best control deck we have in Premium right now. In terms of just pure control. So if that's your play style in other card games, this is the deck for you. But that's it for now, and as always, good luck card fighting.